kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 on Friday the 17th of November. This is Britain's Newsroom here on GB News and my name's Tom Harwood. Coming up today, the Rwanda scheme will fail. The former Home Secretary Suella Braverman declares no asylum seekers will be sent to Rwanda before the next election in her view. This is what the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said when asked if the flights will take off next year.
We can't guarantee that. We have to pass legislation, emergency legislation in the House of Commons. We have to sign a new international treaty with Rwanda.
Benefits crackdown. Claimants who refuse to look for employment after being deemed fit to work could soon lose their state handouts. We'll have the latest. Suppress the free press? That was the chant pro-Palestine protesters aimed at GB News' Patrick Christys as he attended a rally in the Labour constituency of Bethnal Green last night outside the Labour Party office. Let's take a listen.
Why are you here?
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
So a bumper show today with so many stories, and of course it would be nothing without your views and opinions. Get in touch, you know how by now, gbviews@gbnews.com. That's the address to email. I want to hear what you make of all the stories we discussed today. But before all of that, here's your very latest news headlines with Tatiana.
Tom, thank you very much and good morning. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The former Home Secretary says the Prime Minister's plan to deport migrants to Rwanda will fail unless he opts out of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Will the Prime Minister rescue the Rwanda Plan, Mrs Braverman?
Suella Braverman, who was sacked this week, says the proposed new treaty and legislation is simply a tweaked version of the failed Plan A. Writing in The Telegraph, she set out what she's calling her 5 tests to ensure deportation flights can take off. Mrs Braverman says Rishi Sunak's proposal will get bogged down in the courts, but the Transport Secretary Mark Harper says the government won't be stopped.
When you set out very clearly in primary legislation the rules, and that Parliament sets out a very clear interpretation, as the Prime Minister says we're going to do when he made his announcement on Wednesday, then actually the courts do actually respect that. And as far as overseas courts are concerned, the Prime Minister has made it clear that we're not going to let overseas courts stand in our way. We're going to set out the rules very carefully. We're going to conclude that treaty with Rwanda, take that legislation through Parliament and continue with our plan.
2 12-year-old boys charged with the murder of a 19-year-old man are due to appear in court. Sean C. Sahai was attacked in Wolverhampton on Monday night. He died at the scene. The children, who cannot be named because of their age, have also been charged with possession of a bladed article. Retail sales have unexpectedly fallen, dropping to their lowest level since the pandemic. The Office for National Statistics says retail sales volumes dipped 0.3% last month. Analysts had expected a rise. Retailers blame the cost of living, reduced footfall and wet weather. £8.3 billion has been promised to fix what the Prime Minister has described as the scourge of potholes. The funding for road maintenance in England will be available to local authorities over the next decade. The money was saved by scrapping the HS2 rail line north of Birmingham. For more on all of those stories, you can visit our website, gbnews.com. Now it's back to Tom.
Thanks, Tatiana. Now, the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, says the Prime Minister's plan to deport migrants to Rwanda will fail unless he opts out of the European Convention of Human Rights and similar international obligations. This comes as the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, says there's no guarantee deportation flights to Rwanda will take off next year. Now, is he the first of many Conservatives who may back down from the government's position? Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
We are hopeful that because of the solutions that the Prime Minister announced, we will be able to get flights off to Rwanda next year. We can't guarantee that. We have to pass legislation, emergency legislation in the House of Commons. We have to sign a new international treaty with Rwanda. But our commitment to the British people is that although the Supreme Court ruling was a setback, we will not allow anything to get in the way of delivering the Prime Minister's pledge to secure our borders by stopping the boats.
That was the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, speaking earlier there. I'm delighted to be joined now in the studio by the Conservative MP Philip Davies and by our political correspondent Olivia Utley. Philip, let's start with you. I suppose the Chancellor had to be a little bit equivocal in his words because there is no guarantee that this legislation, that this treaty, that this will all go through Parliament in time for the spring.
No, exactly. I mean, the problem the government has, of course, is it doesn't have a majority in the House of Lords, and therefore, even though the government can make things go quickly through the House of Commons, it can't do the same through the House of Lords. It doesn't have a majority to do so. So we have to put pressure on the Lords to sort of go along with this and say that we don't want them to be the unelected House to stop what the public clearly want. But we can't guarantee that because of that lack of majority. So, you know, we have to be honest with people.
The Conservative Party only holds 1/3 of the seats of the House of Lords, but has been in power one form or another for the last 13 years. Is there an argument that what the Labour Party has been saying for a few years now, that what the Liberal Democrat Party has been saying for decades now, is there an argument for reforming the way that the House of Lords work, for making it more democratic?
To be honest, if it were down to me, I'd abolish the House of Lords, to be perfectly honest. I don't think they serve any particular useful purpose. You've basically got a bunch of left-wing stooges in there who basically...
They would say they do a vital work of scrutinising legislation,
yes,
of revising legislation.
I'm sure they do, but they should leave. We should do that job properly in the House of Commons, to be honest. In effect, we don't do our job properly in the House of Commons and leave it to the Lords. Let's get rid of the Lords, let's make sure we do that job properly. It'd be my solution to the problem. Well, look, the government has got that restraint, whether we like it or not, of the House of Lords. I don't actually think there's a million miles between what Suella Braverman's saying, which I would broadly agree with, and what Rishi Sunak's saying, to be perfectly honest. I don't see a million miles between them. They're both saying we need to do whatever it takes to get this policy up and running and to get it delivered. I think they're pretty much on a similar page.
Well, let's bring in Olivia Utley now, because what the former Home Secretary has said in The Telegraph is really her second big attack on Rishi Sunak, and is asking for some pretty extraordinary things, to disapply many international obligations with what are called notwithstanding clauses.
Well, exactly. Essentially a way to circumvent the Supreme Court's ruling. I mean, the question that I think lots of Telegraph readers seeing this piece and GB News viewers watching this will wonder is, if she knows exactly how to fix this problem, why is she writing it in The Telegraph 4 days after resigning as the Home Secretary? Why didn't she think that this was all going to be coming down the line and put some plans in place? I think her argument, and I've spoken to some of her allies, would be that she did. She tried to raise these issues, but the Prime Minister just didn't listen to her. Sunak's allies say that's not the case. She simply wasn't competent enough to manage to get what she wanted to do across. So I think this battle between the two of them is going to keep going on. And what's tricky for Rishi Sunak is while she was on the front benches, she obviously couldn't criticise the government at all. From the back benches, she very much can. And there are a number of MPs who she brings with her.
It's interesting because the government keeps saying we expected or we were preparing for this sort of Supreme Court outcome, and we've done all the legwork, we've almost written this new treaty already, it's going to be ready within days. Well, surely that was all happening under Suella Braverman.
Well, absolutely, and also you sort of wonder, why did it get to the Supreme Court if they knew that they were going to fail in the Supreme Court, which appears to be, I mean, reading between the lines what government ministers have been saying recently. Why did they let themselves get into a position where they would be about to fail in the Supreme Court? Why has Rishi Sunak been saying all year, over and over again, that he's going to be able to stop the boats by the end of the year, only to be caught on the hop now on mid-November, getting towards the end of November, with a court ruling, which everyone seemed to think was very predictable, which essentially says you've got to go back to square one?
Well, let's have a look at the reaction from the wider Conservative Party now, because there's a tweet that caught my eye last night from the former Immigration Minister Damian Green, a Conservative. Now, he says, of Suella Braverman's 5 tests, the second test, now this is the one about disapplying courts, about the notwithstanding clauses to disapply the ECHR and other international obligations, he says that is the most unconservative statement I have ever heard from a Conservative politician. He says, giving the state the explicit power to override every legal constraint is what Putin or President Xi would do. Philip Davies, your reaction to that?
Well, I don't agree with Damian Green about this, to be perfectly honest. I think that what Suella is saying is that we need to do whatever it takes to sort out this problem, which is pretty much what the Prime Minister said. And just following on from Olivia's point, I mean, people might also reflect that Suella Braverman, apart from being the Home Secretary under Rishi and under Liz Truss, was also the Attorney General for 2 years under Boris Johnson, who obviously had a big role to play. So it's surprising that, given that she knows what needs to be done to sort it out, it wasn't done then. But I think Damian's wrong. But I think what it does highlight is the fact that there is not a majority in Parliament to do things like leave the ECHR. There just isn't a majority. I'd love to leave the European Court of Human Rights. I think it's a joke court, to be perfectly honest. But there isn't a majority to do it. And so Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, has got to work within the constraints of what he's got in Parliament. I think where we may end up, is in a situation where we fight the next election on delivering what Suella Braverman's saying in her paper, which I think the Prime Minister broadly supports. I mean, he said we're going to ignore rulings from foreign courts. So, I mean, they're not really miles away. I think we may fight the next election on that to sort this out and get every Conservative candidate to say, you will sign up to this or you will not be a Conservative candidate at the next election.
I mean, that's basically what Boris Johnson did in 2019 when no version of Brexit could get through past the Commons or indeed past the Lords. What the Conservative Party did then was say, right, this is our plan, we're going to go to the country's going to endorse it, and then we're going to leave the EU that way. That's what happened. Are you suggesting that a similar strategy would be, look, we're trying to deal with illegal immigration, the Lords is blocking us, the courts are blocking us, here's our plan, let's go to the country on the basis of that plan and hope the country endorse you?
Yes, but you'd have to have a situation where each Conservative candidate pledged that they would support that, because otherwise you'd end up back in the same situation if people like Damian Green and his acolytes refuse to support it. So you'd have to have that as part of their promise as being a Conservative candidate.
I wonder how many people would vote on the basis of promises rather than delivery. It might work once. Whether it would work a second time over is a big question. But there's more going on today, because get back to work. That's the message from the government in a major benefits shake-up. Free prescriptions and legal aid could be cut off for benefit claimants if they're deemed fit to work and are not seeking employment. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has said the measures were necessary to prevent anyone from choosing to coast on the hard work of taxpayers from receiving benefits. Well, Philip Davies, what are your thoughts on this? I suppose some people would think, why isn't this the case already?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. I mean, to be honest, this is going back pretty much to the regime that Ian Duncan Smith introduced when he was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and obviously Esther was the Employment Minister at the time, and they had this kind of system where, in effect, it was if you were unemployed, it was your full-time job to find a job. There was no sort of loafing about and idling about, and if you didn't spend all of your time looking for a job, you'd be sanctioned. And it seems that COVID stopped all of that. We stopped all conditionality.
And we're talking about these millions of people who are supposedly on long-term sickness now. And it seems to me that a lot of parties in the House of Commons will say, oh, it's terrible, we've got all these very sick people in the country, without wanting to look beyond the headline data and say, hang on, are they actually sick?
Exactly, and we need to go back to, I mean, when they introduced sort of PIP, that was about having face-to-face assessments.
Personal independence payments.
Personal independence payments, which was about make sure you had face-to-face assessments to make sure that people who said they weren't fit to work genuinely weren't fit to work. And we lost all of that conditionality during the lockdowns when all of this stopped.
Right.
So in effect, what it seems to me the government are doing, quite rightly, is reintroducing the sort of regime that Ian Duncan Smith had as Secretary of State to make sure that we've got all these people who are economically inactive at the same time as 1 million job vacancies, and that we can't allow that to continue.
And yet, Olivia, this morning the Labour Party is saying that this is cruel, that the government shouldn't take away free prescriptions, shouldn't take away healthcare from people who are out of work. Is that a message that will land?
Well, I suspect, I don't know for a fact, I suspect it's a massive message that won't land. I think that the government has calculated that there are more taxpayers in this country than there are benefits claimants. And on the
Just
whole,
about.
those taxpayers don't seem to have a huge amount of sympathy for those who are fit to work, but aren't doing a job. I think that's the key issue. The wider problem for Jeremy Hunt is that he has all of these measures to get people back into work, but will it make that much of a difference to the economy? OK, you have a handful of people who are on benefits, not fit to work, going back into the workplace because of this. You have perhaps more mothers going back into work because of the free childcare option. But ultimately, when you have a very, very high tax burden, as you have at the moment, Jeremy Hunt introduced these sort of stealth taxes. So now people in paying the top rate band of tax are actually not really earning that much at all. Very, very high tax burden is ultimately a disincentive to work. So all these tinkering around the edges might not make that much of a difference to the economy.
It's about 5 times as many people now paying that very top rate of tax compared to when it was introduced, which is a fascinating sort of fiscal drag effect of inflation. But I wonder, there has been criticism of these assessments that the government make of whether people are fit to work or not in the past, that sometimes the government isn't that good at assessing. They'll say some people are not fit to work who are, and they'll say some people are fit to work who aren't.
Exactly, and I think that's the problem. In a situation like this, you just can't afford to have even a few people slipping through the net, and that is what happens in a sort of labyrinthine system like this. There are bound to be, human error. Human error is understandable, but if you're in a situation where someone who is physically incapable of working, someone who is in too much pain to work, who's been on an NHS waiting list for 2 years waiting for an operation, is unable to get their benefits because of a slip-up in the system, then you do end up in a very sort of cruel setting for those people, and then there will be serious criticism.
But I wonder if one of the mechanisms for writing that is going to see local members of Parliament. Phil, I don't know if you've had casework that involves people who might have been sanctioned perhaps improperly, and I wouldn't expect you to go into the details of any case, but I suppose there is in the round that option for people who feel they've been hard done by to go to their MP to seek redress.
Yeah, I mean, Olivia's right. There are mistakes made on initial assessment. The government would often say that's because people didn't come armed with all the information, and that when they appeal the decision and they provide more information and doctor certificates, etc., that their appeal then is successful, and that the issue is not bringing all the information to bear. To start with. But look, this isn't just good for taxpayers, and this is also about the people who are not working. I mean, actually, we're in danger, and the left often in this country are in danger of just writing off people. Saying, actually, there's millions of people out there, and we're just going to write them off. We're just going to say they don't need to work. We're not going to bother with them. We'll bring in cheap labour from abroad to do jobs that actually these people are capable of doing. Actually, why should we write off people? I mean, actually, we want these people to actually be ready to work, to be in a position where they can work, and actually with all the dignity that work brings. So I don't think it's just good for taxpayers. I think it's good for the people themselves, that they can actually get a job and get the benefits of work.
Certainly. It's a very interesting policy proposal, because I suppose it's not just about the economics of this. This isn't just about getting people back to work. There is some politics going on here too. I suppose in 2015, the Conservatives found that if there's a street where, you know, some people are working and some people aren't, people who are on low incomes would feel pretty aggrieved if people living next door to them are living the same sort of lifestyle but without getting out of bed every morning.
Well, absolutely. There has to be an incentive to go to work and pay your taxes. And obviously there is a problem in this country at the moment. In certain cities in the UK, Manchester, Liverpool being among them, 1/5 of working age people who are fit to work are not working. Now, you know, that is a serious, serious issue. Some of them may have problems that prevent them from working, but there are certainly others who probably could be working, and the assessments need to be a bit clearer on that. So I think this is, you know, a Conservative policy. You can see why the government is introducing it. The only issue is if the government systems let them down, a few people slip through the cracks, and then you have some pretty awful stories.
Yeah, and it's those individual pieces of bad press that have in the past perhaps scuppered the government, or at least created some consternation there. Let's move on to one extra story now, because pro-Palestine protest caused chaos yet again in London last night. This one in the Labour constituency of Bethnal Green, outside the Labour Party office. Well, let's take a look at how GB News presenter Patrick Christys was welcomed when he arrived, and when he asked why they're protesting.
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
Why?
Shame on you!
Shame on you! Tell me why. You know why you're here?
What do you think?
Why do you feel so strongly?
What do you think? What do you think? Work it out.
You need to stop harassing the community. I believe you need to go.
It's a free
Please.
press.
I know it's a free place, but what it is, you're harassing our community.
Someone with a megaphone there shouting at Patrick Christys saying, "You are harassing our community." Now, I don't know if any impartial observers would think otherwise, but I can't help but thinking that if there was anyone harassing anyone in that clip, it was the man with the megaphone. Philip Davies, we did see a police officer in the background there. Do you think the police have got the balance right when it comes to policing these protests?
No, I don't. And look, I'm all for people having the right to protest. There's a million ways in which you can protest. You do not need to be in a mob outside an MP's office, which is designed to be intimidatory, it's designed to be threatening. That is not, to me, that is not acceptable. That is not acceptable. You can protest. I've got lots of my constituents have emailed me. I've got a very high Muslim population. My constituency is part of Bradford. They've emailed me with their views. Some of the messages have been pretty unsavoury, but they're perfect. If you want to protest against what your MP's doing, you can email them and tell them what you think. You do not need to stand like that, like a mob, intimidating and threatening a local member of Parliament, and the police should not allow that to happen. I mean, you can't say that that's anything other than intimidatory and threatening, and for me, that's not acceptable.
Do you feel safe as a Member of Parliament in this environment? Because it's only a couple of years ago that one of your colleagues was murdered by an Islamist terrorist because of his views on foreign policy. Now, this was a protest against a Labour MP because she didn't vote the way the mob wanted her to vote.
I have felt less safe in my constituency over the last few weeks, probably for the first time ever. I got selected as the candidate for Shipley over 20 years ago. It's the first time I've ever felt nervous about being in my constituency. Wow. I have had some very unpleasant emails. A man did spend a night in police custody based on one of the emails that he sent to me about 2 weeks ago. It has been quite nasty, some of the messages that have been sent completely unnecessary. And I have felt more nervous about it than ever before. And it's not acceptable. I'm quite a robust character, but it is not acceptable, really.
No, it is fascinating, Olivia, because outside of Parliament, we saw these big protests. We both got messages from the House of Commons authorities saying, make sure you leave through different exits at a time like this. I mean, there is a level of intimidation going on.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. That's what I've been hearing when I've been talking to people on the streets. I've been reporting on these Palestinian protests, and I've been trying to chat to people surrounding the protests. And what I keep hearing is that almost everyone totally respects the freedom of speech, but they are getting worried that freedom of speech is now interfering with their freedom to live their ordinary lives. And I think at some point that balance is going to get under the spotlight a little bit. And Mark Rowley last week, as a Met Commissioner, decided that it was safe to go ahead with that protest. And he probably just about made the right call there. Everything was, if not completely peaceful, then at least the 2-minute silence at the cenotaph was observed in a dignified manner. But as the weeks wear on, there is no sign of these protests being cancelled or abating anytime soon. At what point will that balance for freedom of speech versus freedom to live your ordinary life start weighing up the other way?
And it does seem that there are elements of intimidation at these marches. It does seem that there are elements... Now, not everyone who goes on this march is someone who is a Hamas sympathiser, of course. Not everyone who goes on these marches is someone who wants to see violence. A lot of these people have a very deep-seated view that violence in the Middle East is bad. But just finally, Philip Davies, at what point does the police need to step up its policing and make sure that the violent elements within these crowds are properly taken care of?
Yeah, they need to be much more proactive in actually calling out and arresting people who are breaking the law. I mean, there was last weekend there was a ridiculous situation where they put out a picture of two people whose faces were completely covered apart from their eyes and said, we're wanting to identify these two people for criminal activity. I mean, who on earth is going to be able to identify them?
Well,
should have arrested them at the time.
It says it all. Well, Philip Davies and Olivia Utley, thank you so much for talking through those stories. Still much more to come, not least more on Suella Braverman after this.
Good morning, Alex Burkill here again with your latest GB News weather forecast. Whilst the weekend's looking wet and windy for many of us, today is actually going to be largely dry. It is a bit of a chilly start for some of us. There's some frost around, also some patches of mist and fog, but a lot of dry weather, just a few showers through the morning across some parts of Western England and into Wales as well, though these will ease as we go through the afternoon. So for many, looking largely dry and plenty of sunshine. Turning cloudier towards the southwest though, ahead of some rain arriving later. Temperatures around or a little bit below average for the time of year, many places staying in single figures, milder towards the southwest as this wet and windy weather then pushes its way in. That is going to bring some unsettled weather through the night. It's also going to lift our temperatures. So after an initially chilly start to the night, it is going to be quite a bit milder by the time we head towards dawn on Saturday morning. But it is going to be a wet and windy picture for many of us when we wake up. The heaviest rain likely to be across some parts of the southwest, and here with saturated ground already, we're likely to see some issues with the potential for some flooding, also more disruption to travel. But the heaviest rain and those strong winds will clear away towards the east as we go through the day, with something perhaps a bit drier and brighter following in behind, but a few showers. And look at those temperatures, highs of around 15 or 16 Celsius. As we go into Sunday, and it's going to be a showery day, so there'll be some drier spells in between those heavy showers, but still windy and temperatures down a touch. Bye-bye, have a great day.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
A very good morning, it's 10 a.m. on Friday the 17th of November and this is Britain's Newsroom here on GB News. My name's Tom Harwood and here's what's coming up today. The Rwanda Treaty will fail. The Home Secretary Suella Braverman declares no asylum seekers will be sent to Rwanda before the next election in her view. Too soft on drugs? A Conservative police and crime commissioner slams enforcement laws around Class B and C drugs as, quotes, pathetically weak. We'll debate that. Suppress the free press. That was the chant pro-Palestine protesters aimed at GB News' very own Patrick Christie's as he attended a rally in the Labour constituency of Bethnal Green last night. Let's take a listen.
Why are you here?
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
And of course, this show is nothing without you. We want your thoughts, your opinions, your views on all of the stories we're discussing today. gbviews@gbnews.com is the address to email into. We'll be getting to those just after the news headlines with Tatiana.
Tom, thank you. It's 10 o'clock. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The former Home Secretary says the Prime Minister's plan to deport migrants to Rwanda will fail unless he opts out of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Will the Prime Minister rescue the Rwanda Plan, Mrs Braverman?
Suella Braverman, who was sacked this week, says the proposed new treaty and legislation are simply a tweaked version of the failed Plan A. Writing in The Telegraph, she set out what she's calling her 5 tests to ensure deportation flights can take off. Mrs Braverman says Rishi Sunak's proposal will get bogged down in the courts, but the Transport Secretary Mark Harper says the government won't be stopped.
When you set out very clearly in primary legislation the rules, and that Parliament sets out a very clear interpretation, as the Prime Minister says we're going to do when he made his announcement on Wednesday, then actually the courts do actually respect that. And as far as overseas courts are concerned, the Prime Minister has made it clear that we're not going to let overseas courts stand in our way. We're going to set out the rules very carefully. We're going to conclude that treaty with Rwanda, take that legislation through Parliament and continue with our plan.
2 12-year-old boys charged with the murder of a 19-year-old man are due to appear in court. Sean Sisahai was attacked in Wolverhampton on Monday night. He died at the scene. The children, who cannot be named because of their age, have also been charged with possession of a bladed article. Retail sales have unexpectedly fallen, dropping to their lowest levels since the pandemic. The Office for National Statistics says retail sales volumes dipped 0.3% last month. Analysts had expected a rise. Retailers blame the cost of living, reduced footfall and wet weather. Sir Keir Starmer will pledge to make Britain a clean energy superpower. The Labour leader's in Aberdeen, where he'll tell industry bosses he'll support up to 50,000 jobs in Scotland if his party wins the next election. His visit comes at the end of a challenging week, suffering a major rebellion over his position on the war in Gaza. GB News understands there's concern within the party of a growing rift between Sir Keir and the Scottish Labour leader. Anas Sarwar's MSPs look likely to back an amendment in Holyrood next week calling for a ceasefire. £8.3 billion has been promised to fix what the Prime Minister has described as the scourge of potholes. The funding for road maintenance in England will be available to local authorities over the next decade. The money was saved by scrapping the HS2 rail line north of Birmingham. Pothole campaigner Mark Morrell, also known as Mr Pothole, says the investment isn't enough.
Road users are being battered in terms of costs, with tens of billions of pounds in all sorts of taxation, very little being spent on our roads. I mean, with this extra funding, when it fully comes on stream, it will only bring it back up to what they were spending in 2019. And that's, 50% of what was being spent in 2006. So, if you're allowed for inflation, we should be putting in nearly £6 or £7 billion a year, not, £2 billion is going to be offered over the next 11 years.
Rat-infested Bedford Prison has been issued with an urgent notice to improve. Inspectors found inmates are being held in mouldy cells with broken windows for up to 23 hours a day. Levels of violence against staff in the last month were also the highest of any adult male prison in the country and recorded self-harm the third highest rate. It's the fifth jail to be given an urgent notice in the last 12 months. New draft guidance for the NHS says women should be offered talking therapy to combat symptoms of menopause. That's alongside or instead of hormone replacement therapy. Better advice will also be offered about the risks and the benefits of HRT. Cognitive behavioural therapy is also being suggested to help with hot flushes and sleep and mood changes. The health watchdog says the move will give women more choice, but menopause specialist Dr. Louise Newson has called the update disappointing. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now back to Tom.
Thank you, Tatiana. Now let's have a little look at what you've all been saying at home, because Jim has written in to talk about the Rwanda scheme, saying, what is the point of the Rwanda Plan? We've got 55,000 illegals in four-star hotels. Even if the scheme got the go-ahead, we're talking about a few hundred people. Now, Jim, I think the government would say to that they want it as a deterrent rather than a means to get rid of 55,000 people. But I think you have a point there. Sometimes they don't sound like that's what they mean. Derek says, Suella is saying you have to take extrajudicial powers to bypass the courts by declaring a state of emergency, or you can never stop the boat. And yes, and that's caused some consternation on the Conservative benches, with some Conservatives saying just ignoring the courts would be an unconservative thing to do. Alison has written in to say anyone who sends threatening messages to MPs should be kicked out. And that's after, of course, that mob descended on a Labour constituency office last night. Of course, the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, has said people found to be supporting Hamas will be removed from the country if they're not British citizens. So let's see if that goes any further. And Ginny has written in to say, surely if we're to get fraudulent benefit claimants back to work, you need sufficient civil servants at their desks to process that policy. And of course, the level of civil service members at work has been a point of consternation, not least because this week the government has said civil servants now must come into the office at least 3 days a week. So maybe that's addressing some of your concerns, Ginny. But we're going to move on now because on the week Rishi Sunak vowed to get his Rwanda scheme back on track and stop the boats, GB News can reveal this morning that around 1,000 people have crossed in small boats in recent days. A break in the weather at the beginning of the week and again yesterday saw around 20 small boats make the crossing from France. Let's go now to GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White, who is in Dover with this breaking news for us. Mark.
I think this just shows, Tom, that whatever the government says about the fact that small boat crossing numbers are down compared to last year, and that is true, they're down about a third. Anytime there is actually decent weather out in the channel, these boats will keep coming. And I think those that are keen channel watchers believe that the reduction in the number of small boats crossing the English Channel is down to the fact that we've had very unpredictable weather for most of the last year, really, with northerly winds blowing a lot of the time, which makes it difficult for these boats to get across from France to push off in the first place. But as I say, when those weather conditions improve, as they did yesterday and as they did at the beginning of the week, and again today, the weather conditions are pretty good out in the channel, and our intelligence is that a number of boats will be, according to contacts we have on the other side of the channel, kicking off from those beaches in France later on today to try to make it across to UK waters. So that's 1,000 at least so far this week, and we are right in the middle of winter now, well into November, and still the boats keep coming, Tom.
It's extraordinary because the government has been saying that it's got this multi-pronged approach, not least Rwanda, that deterrent being part of it, but also lots of other things. The money that we're giving France, the government say that more than 20,000 people have been stopped by French forces on the beaches there. Are you suggesting that perhaps the government's optimism about the other strands of its policy is misplaced, that actually what matters most of all here is the weather?
I think the weather plays a huge part in it, yes. It's true that the French are stopping boats from leaving their beaches. They did that last year as well. But all that happens, Tom, is these people aren't arrested and then detained or deported or anything like that. They are, some of them may be detained, most of them just scatter back into the dunes again to regroup and be put on another boat a day or two later when weather conditions improve. So all you're doing really in stopping those people coming across is delaying the inevitable in the vast majority of cases. These people will just regroup and try again. And it's such a lucrative industry for the criminal gangs involved in this. If they are charging 3,000 or so, it's between 3,000 and 5,000 to get on one of these boats. Well, there's more than 50 people go on a boat, so 150,000 at least they're making for each boat they push into the water. You can understand why the people smugglers are so determined to continue with this illegal trade. And of course, they have got very sophisticated at it. They are able to procure the boats, get them manufactured to order in countries like China. They get shipped to Turkey. They then get smuggled from Turkey across into the European Union, up to the likes of Germany, where when they're ready to be sent to northwestern France, again they're shipped to the coast of northwestern France. They're blown up there on the beaches and they run to the water. As we said, some get stopped, but many don't, and they continue to head over here to the UK.
Mark, just going by numbers here, we're getting close to the end of the year. You're saying perhaps 1,000 people in the last few days coming across to the United Kingdom in small boats. Do you think that by the end of the year, the government will still be able to say this year arrivals are a third lower than last year? Or might that number shift?
Well, I think that all really depends on the weather again. I think will be a big factor in this. November of last year, we had some really good fairly lengthy spells of decent weather, which meant that it was a very busy month in November. So if the same happens this month, if even in December there are some good days, then yes, that number will climb. It's about a third down on where we were at this time last year. It's possible it'll stay at that. It might even increase in the government's favour. But still, we're talking, Tom, the number of people that have come across since the 1st of January is 27,500 people who've come across the channel. So it might be down, but it's still a very significant problem. And these people still need to be accommodated in the likes of hotels. The government says it wants to get away from the over-reliance on hotels. But every time, if we had 500 come across yesterday and then 600 odd at the beginning of the week, they all need to be accommodated somewhere, and the alternative, the plan B in terms of accommodation, isn't properly functioning as yet. The BBC Stockholm, after the issue with that outbreak of Legionella that was discovered in the water system there, they haven't come back en masse onto that boat yet. There's just a few people now back onto the BBC Stockholm barge, and again with Wethersfield, there's only a couple of hundred of the supposed 1,700 in Wethersfield in Essex that are supposed to be at that old RAF base. And Scampton, we were supposed to have 2,000 people up in RAF Scampton. Not a single person has gone on to that particular former air base yet. So these people are being accommodated in the likes of hotels or council accommodation across the country.
Well, Mark White, thank you very much for bringing us the very latest there from Dover. We'll be back with you throughout the programme as we get more information on any more boats. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by political commentator John Oxley. And John, I suppose when the Prime Minister first made this pledge, stood at the podium with the words "Stop the boats" beneath him, people would have assumed that meant stop every boat. It's probably not good enough for Rishi Sunak to keep saying this phrase that the number of crossings are down by a third.
That's exactly right, Tom. When you make a big pledge like that, particularly when you make it one of your key priorities, you're saying to the public, we're going to fix this problem, not we're going to make it slightly better. And particularly, as your Mark was saying, a big part of that has been the weather's not been great. And so there's every chance that come next spring, potentially when there's election, or through the summer running up to an election in the autumn, we'll have weeks and weeks of really sunny weather, and then suddenly it will not just be an increase on this year, it will be an increase on last year, which was the biggest ever year. And that's going to be very embarrassing for the Prime Minister who said stop the boats.
And this is a real risk in terms of when the Prime Minister decides to go for a general election. There's, I think, perhaps a consensus that the Prime Minister wants to leave it a bit later than the spring, perhaps October, perhaps November. The very latest he could go would be mid-January, but I think that might be a bit too much for anyone to bear, campaigning over Christmas. What do you think that the idea that there might be more crossings over the summer might do to that calculation of when a general election might come?
I think it's one of those things that you would potentially you go earlier if you've got this is a big problem on the horizon. If your experts are saying actually this year is going to be really bad, you maybe go for May before that problem's ramped up. Because if you hang on over the summer, you go into the autumn, that data will have come in. But the other thing is the Prime Minister needs to balance that around some of the other key priorities that could be a big electoral problem for him. Another one is NHS waiting times. Those are still going up. If you go into sort of October, November, December, as we're seeing at the moment, that is the sort of winter peak time for the NHS. Those lists expand, people get sick because it's winter, people's bills go up because if heating costs remain high, that's when your heating bills go up. So it's a really difficult calculation. And frankly, when you're losing this badly in the polls and you're doing this badly against your own priorities, there's not many good answers.
When GB News came out at the start of this week with a poll showing the Conservative Party on 20%, I think a lot of people scoffed at it, thinking they're not that low, this is inflating the Reform Party or whatever. But now 4 more polls have come out showing the Conservative Party at 19, 20, 21 and 22% respectively. It seems that the Conservative Party has been declining in the polls in the last 7 days, perhaps after that reshuffle.
I think that's true. I mean, the best guidance always with polls is you don't look at individual polls, you look at trends and see how they're moving overall. And so whether it's 19 or 21% is kind of immaterial. What you're seeing is it is getting worse again for the Tories. It's back to those sort of numbers. And potentially that's something around the reshuffle. Potentially it's just as time goes on for Rishi Sunak, he's made these pledges, he's not delivering against them. All those other things are kicking off as well. You know, NHS waiting times are really bad at the moment.
And yet this is the week that Rishi Sunak has been trumpeting his first pledge, halving inflation, has actually been achieved. I suppose this goes into this perennial dilemma. If something is written down before you, do you feel like it's true rather than you can just see it there on the paper?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue, and particularly for the thing around inflation. You know, we need to remember that's about how much prices are going up by. The increases already have been locked in. And I think for most people, most voters, you're going to the supermarket and you're seeing milk, bread, eggs, twice the price they were 2 years ago. Your rent has gone up, maybe your mortgage has gone up. You're not thinking, oh, well, now it's only going up at a slower rate. That's great, I'm going to go out and vote Tory. You're thinking, well, I get paid this much and I'm spending more and more of it on the daily essentials. Maybe it is time for a change.
And that is the phrase that I think focus groups have been coming up with now for quite some time. This idea that the government has had quite a long time to try and fix these problems, and that something else, and that it is time for a change. Rishi Sunak lent into that in October, at the start of October, with his conference speech saying, "I'm the change candidate." He seems to be walking back from that pitch now. Do you think someone in Number 10 has said, Prime Minister, trying to say that you're the change candidate sounds a little bit silly?
I think that very well may have happened, because it is bizarre when your party has been in power for 13 years, you yourself have been at the top table for a few years now, coming out and saying, I'm the change, not just from a few years ago, but from the past 30 years. It does seem a bit odd. And I think also what's going on with that is, the Conservatives were more popular in the past. Maybe change isn't what people are looking for. And I think that's one of the interesting things about David Cameron coming back. Is it a chance to try and say, particularly in those seats where the Tories fear the Lib Dems, actually, no, we're the guys you backed in 2010 when we did well, in 2015 when we won a majority. Maybe sort of a more sort of back to the future type message, rather than we're going to radically change things again.
Where we're going, they won't need roads. Well, John Oxley, thank you so much for talking us through those big issues of Conservative electability and indeed policy conundrums. Still to come, access to Class B and C drugs is on the rise, but a Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner has said that law enforcement around them is pathetically weak. This is Britain's Newsroom on GB News.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's on your teeth.
It's on your teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning, it's 10:24 and you're with Britain's Newsroom here on GB News with me, Tom Harwood. Now, earlier this month, nitrous oxide, popularly known as laughing gas or on the streets as NOS, became an illegal Class C substance due to possible psychological and physical harm. But what's the point if the law can't be enforced? Alison Hernandez, Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner for Devon and Cornwall, has declared war on Class B and C drugs like laughing gas, cannabis, and describing extra laws and the enforcement of them as being pathetically weak. Well, let's discuss this now. Let's even debate it. We're joined by the former Metropolitan Police Detective Peter Blexley in the studio and the Police and Crime Commissioner for Cleveland, Steve Turner, down the line to discuss this. Peter, let's start with you. This is a perennial issue for the government. Is it possible to win the war on drugs?
Absolutely not. It's a war that will not and cannot be won. And that's been proven over the last 50 years since President Richard Nixon gave a speech to the UN in 1971, declaring drugs as public enemy #1, and hence the war on drugs was coined. It's impossible. Tonight, for example, there will be hundreds of thousands of people in the UK taking drugs. Cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy, you name it. And the majority of those people, the vast majority of those people, hold down responsible jobs, raise contributing children, and actually are a decent part of society. But they are forced into dealing with criminals because they like to recreationally take drugs. The only way to control what is now the 4th biggest industry in the world, yes, it's even bigger than the textiles industry, and look, we're all wearing clothes. The only way to control this industry is to regulate it by legalising the drugs so we can raise billions in tax revenue, we can reduce the harm dramatically, we can shave at least 10% off the prison population, and generally speaking, have some control of this industry.
Steve Turner, over to you. Peter says the only way to have control over it is to legalise, regulate and tax.
That's absolutely rubbish. Legalising a drug is not going to... These drug dealers aren't suddenly going to go off and work in McDonald's to find a different way of making their money. They're just going to find it more harmful substances to sell. We see that in places New York. New York has somewhere in the region of about 2,500 legal cannabis shops, but he's probably got another 2,500 that are illegal. There just isn't the infrastructure to monitor or regulate these things. And all that'll happen is you're just going to push unregulated, more harmful substances that are cut with things like bleach and God knows what else into that. So it's a foolish suggestion, and I'm really surprised somebody of the experience and the knowledge as this man has is even suggesting it, because whilst I appreciate it is a massive problem and we're not getting to grips with it, and I don't like the term war on drugs, what we have to do is we have to find ways of improving our public health to allow the people who want to come off drugs to come off drugs while clamping down on the dealers. And I'd love to see some much harsher sentences imposed. And it's not about changing the law. Our justice system has the sentencing powers. You can go to jail for life for a first instance of supplying a Class A drug, but it's never put out there. It's 16 years minimum for somebody who's been found to be supplying Class A's 3 times. When we start to see those sentences handed out, when people don't think it's an easy way to make money, we'll see much less dealers on our streets. And by helping people who want to come off drugs, that's how we reduce the problem. Legalising it and thinking that problem's going to go away and that is just a complete fantasy.
Over to you, Peter.
Well, I'm afraid this Police and Crime Commissioner has showed a staggering lack of appreciation and understanding about who takes the majority of drugs in this country. The problematic drug users, the hapless heroin addicts and the such like, of course deserve services, but the overwhelming majority of people who will finish work tonight and get themselves wrapped around a gram of cocaine or a joint, for example, of cannabis, will be the painters and decorators, the chippies, the sparks, the plumbers, the scaffolders, the city boys who will be drinking champagne along with their cocaine, and they are the overwhelming majority of people who take drugs. And if there was a way, by legalising and regulating drugs, that those people were not forced into criminal deals but bought them over the counter, for example, then we would have so many resources available for the hapless addicts, we would so dramatically cut the prison population, and we would take some control, considerable control, over the 4th biggest industry in the world. If drugs were invented today and we sat in front of the cabinet and said, here we go, cannabis, cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, they're all new, we've discovered them in a lab and grown them, who will we let run this industry that will be the 4th biggest in the world? Who on earth would say, we'll let criminals run the industry? That's the lunacy of it all.
Steve, what you're suggesting is lunacy.
Yeah, he's wrong. I don't disagree about the people who are taking these drugs. Why don't we take the passport off anybody caught? Any city boy, as you put it, or chippy, or painter and decorator, or sparky caught with it, why don't we take their passport off them so they can't go on a family holiday this year? I'm telling you now, that would guarantee to drop drug use in this country. And by targeting the dealers and making it much harder for those people, because, again, they're not wandering around the streets, they're not seeing the violence, they're getting it delivered to their door quicker than pizza. That's what we need to stop, and that's what we need to clamp down hard on. Not regulating it or putting it out there, because that just doesn't work. And what you're doing, those vulnerable people who you did mention, those are the people I'm concerned about, because they're the ones that are still going to go at the street dealers, and they're still going to be taking badly cut, high-strength drugs that are likely to kill them far quicker than what we've got now. Take the dealers off, target the dealers, and that's how we stop this.
Steve, isn't one of the arguments that the reason why some drugs are cut with poisonous substances is because it's in the hands of the criminal gangs? Back when you could buy cocaine in Boots, back when Queen Victoria was enjoying her cocaine, as we know that she did, there were less problems with this stuff being cut with poisons.
but it's still going to happen. That's what I'm saying. If you take your average drug dealer and think that for 1 minute, because you can suddenly now buy it in Boots, that they're going to go off and get a proper job, they're not. They're going to find different ways, different products to sell to the most vulnerable. And yes, you might protect a few high-flying executives who like some coke on a Friday and a Saturday night as part of their party lifestyle. You're not. You are potentially increasing the harm, right, and raising the tragedies amongst those who need our support most by not dealing with the drug dealers and burying your head in the sand that thinks because we've regulated it, all of those drug dealers are going to go work in McDonald's or in a supermarket somewhere.
Now, Peter, finally to you. Are you not living in cloud cuckoo land? There's no way that this government or any Western government is going to legalise the roster of drugs that you suggested.
Well, many enlightened Western governments have already adopted a different drugs policy, and there, in countries like Portugal, for example...
Decriminalisation, not legalisation.
Yes, I know. It's a bit of a halfway house, but it's a step in the right direction. We've seen a dramatic reduction in the harm that drugs can cause. And talking of harm, prior to 1971, we had far fewer heroin addicts than we do now. In fact, they got their heroin from doctors on prescription. It was only since the Misuse of Drugs Act that heroin addict rates have gone sky high.
Peter and Steve, I wish we could continue this conversation further. I'm afraid we have run to the end of this slot, but we will get you both back because I know there is so much more to discuss. Well, still to come, a wand without a wizard, or a wizard without a wand. Lisa Nandy has criticised J.K. Rowling for not treating transgender women as women due to their body parts, explaining some women come with snapes and all sizes. Also, grandma grooving. Have you seen this grandma rocking it at a 50-cent show? We'll discuss, can you ever be too old for rap music? All of that and much more after your morning news with Tatiana.
Tom, thank you. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The former Home Secretary says the Prime Minister's plan to deport migrants to Rwanda will fail unless he opts out of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Will the Prime Minister rescue the Rwanda Plan, Mrs Braverman?
Suella Braverman, who was sacked this week, says the proposed new treaty and legislation are simply a tweaked version of the failed Plan A. Writing in The Telegraph, she set out what she's calling her 5 tests to ensure deportation flights can take off. Mrs Braverman says Rishi Sunak's proposal will get bogged down in the courts. 2 12-year-old boys charged with the murder of a 19-year-old man are due to appear in court. Sean C. Sahai was attacked in Wolverhampton on Monday night and died at the scene. The children, who cannot be named because of their age, have also been charged with possession of a bladed article. Retail sales have unexpectedly fallen, dropping to their lowest level since the pandemic. The Office for National Statistics says retail sales volumes dipped 0.3% last month. Analysts had expected a rise. Retailers blame the cost of living, reduced footfall and wet weather. £8.3 billion has been promised to fix what the Prime Minister has described as the scourge of potholes. The funding for road maintenance in England will be available to local authorities over the next decade. The money was saved by scrapping the HS2 rail line north of Birmingham. For more on all of those stories, you can visit our website, gbnews.com.
For stunning gold and silver coins you'll always value, Rosland Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2422 and 1.1440 euros. The price of gold is £1,603 and 62 pence per ounce. And the FTSE 100's at 7,474 points.
Rosland Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Well, still to come, why have EU lawmakers lost the plot? This time, it's cheese. You're with Britain's Newsroom here on GB News.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
It's 10:39. You're with Britain's Newsroom here on GB News with me, Tom Harwood. Now, pro-Palestine protest chaos continued across London last night. This one forced in the, I beg your pardon, in the Labour constituency of Bethnal Green, there was a particular conundrum. Let's take a look at how GB News presenter Patrick Christys was welcomed when he arrived, asking why those there were protesting.
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
Why?
Shame on you!
Tell me why. You know why you're here?
What do you think?
Why do you feel so strongly?
What do you think? What do you think? Work it out.
You need to stop harassing the community. I believe you need to go.
It's a free
Please.
press.
I know it's a free place, but what it is, you're harassing our community.
Well, there we have it. Crowd gathered around the Labour Party office there in Bethnal Green and Bow because the local MP had not voted in favour of a ceasefire on Wednesday evening. Well, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio now by political commentator Matthew Stadlen and the former editor of the Daily Express, Dawn Neeson. Now, Dawn, let's start with you. Is it appropriate to have sort of gangs around an MP's local office?
No, it isn't. And look, I mean, it's Rishanara Ali and Absama Begum are the two local MPs in Tower Hamlets. They're both very young, very strong, very independently minded Muslim women who, I can't tell you, Tom, how hard they have worked to achieve what they have achieved, coming from their backgrounds, both working class backgrounds as well. So the reason they're doing it outside Rishinara's office is because she withheld her vote on the ceasefire, understandably so, obviously. So is it appropriate? No, it's not. Look, I don't go as far as calling these people hate marches. They're not. I think it's a small minority, and this was an offshoot. It's not one of the big marches. But what is more worrying is, I thought Patrick asked a very sensible question there, and it's a question that should be asked. It's like, why are you here? What do you want? Because what frightens me more isn't the fact that they were ganging up outside our Missionari's office. It's the fact that a lot of them don't actually know. There was a clip recently with two young girls who were on a protest march, peacefully, nothing wrong with that. But when they were asked about what Hamas did on October the 7th, they didn't know. They said, oh, I'm not qualified to comment on that. And it's like, well, why are you qualified to go on a march protesting for something you don't know what you're actually protesting for? So that's what worries me more. I mean, I think it's appalling that two young female MPs in that area who have worked incredibly hard are being targeted in this way, because it's both of them are being targeted. I just think it's the fact that it's almost become... It's not quite a fashion, but I think for certain areas, young, more left-wing student-type women in particular, it's almost like it's fashionable to go on a peace march.
It's interesting that you mentioned women there, because there has been perhaps a disproportionate number of women on these marches. I don't know if you've noticed that, Matthew.
I hadn't noticed that, no. What I did notice in that video was some very angry people, I felt, being intimidating towards a journalist. And there's just no place for that on the streets of this country. I very strongly disagree sometimes with what Patrick says on his show and on social media as well. But he was doing his job as a journalist, and he had every right to be there. And for the crowd, it seemed to be alternating between saying shame on you towards the Labour MP or towards the Labour Party more generally, and then also to a journalist going about his work was, well, I thought it was shameful behaviour, actually. There is absolutely no room in this country for intimidating our politicians, our democratically elected politicians, or indeed anyone else. Of course, people have the right to protest. They have the right to protest peacefully and within the law. What we saw there seemed to me to be stretching legal limits to their breaking point.
Now, I understand that last night at this particular protest, there were no arrests. There were police there present. Is it your view that the police have been too lenient then?
Well, I think we've seen certain examples on social media that might appear to show the police not being as firm as they might be entitled to. It's very difficult to criticise the police with a broad brush. It's a very difficult job that they're trying to do. They want to try to maintain order, public safety, and try to make sure that things don't escalate. But all I can say, and I'm not a police officer, is where a crime is committed, the police need to step in. On a wider issue, I'm really increasingly concerned by the spike that we're seeing in anti-Semitism. I'm someone who has spoken out about these marches, saying that they should be allowed to go ahead, and I do maintain that. However, there is a real problem with this chant that we keep hearing, or that we keep hearing discussed, at least, from the river to the sea. Because although it's undoubtedly true that some people who shout it don't mean it anti-Semitically and don't mean it to suggest that Israel should be eradicated from the map, we hear from Jewish people, not all Jewish people necessarily, but from some Jewish people, that they see it and hear it as anti-Semitic. And we know it's part of what Hamas wants to do. It wants to drive out the Jews from the river to the sea.
It's literally their mission statement.
Right,
they were
exactly.
They were elected on that. And even worse, it wasn't just annihilation of the State of Israel. It was annihilation of Jewish people.
Just to finish the point, I read a piece that a friend sent me this morning. It was a shocking piece, but perhaps not surprising to wake up to. It was in The Guardian, and it was an anonymously written piece, and it was written by someone anonymously for his or her own safety. They're an Oxford University student, and they are experiencing anti-Semitism. And the question was, why are academic institutions so affected by anti-Semitism. This is a real concern. I'm Jewish. I haven't had a single friend, and this doesn't mean that they're not well-meaning, I haven't had a single friend call me up in the week since October the 7th to say, are you OK? Not because I identify with Israel. That's also an anti-Semitic trope to assume that all Jews identify with Israel, but just to see whether I'm OK in the context of anti-Semitism rising. And I am someone who relentlessly calls out Islamophobia. Islamophobia is every bit as evil as anti-Semitism. I just worry, and this goes to the David Baddiel book and TV series, and I interviewed him about it for my podcast recently, that Jews don't count. And what does that mean? It just means if we complain of anti-Semitism, I don't think we're taken as seriously by some, not by everyone. The government has been strong on this, and so has Keir Starmer, but I don't think we are taken as seriously as other minorities.
You know what? It's really interesting. I had lunch with a very lovely lady, proper old East Ender, and she was telling me a story about her granddaughter. It's 4 years old. She goes to a school that welcomes all faiths, OK? It's not a very strict school religiously, but it welcomes all faiths. But it happens to have a uniform that lets you know that it is a Jewish school, OK? But it welcomes children of all faiths. This little girl's 4 years old. On the way into school the other day, on the tube, with her mum and dad, she was told, a 4-year-old, wearing her uniform, going to school, just started going to school, remember, at 4, she was told that she was unclean. And that she was basically... but the implication was, you are a filthy Jew. Now, I'm sorry if that's offending, but that was the implication that was aimed at a 4-year-old child on her way to school. And I put that on Twitter because I was so shocked by the story. And look, this is not taking it away from Islamophobia in any way, shape or form. All hate is horrific. I put it on Twitter, and you know what? You know what? What really annoyed me was people going, you're making it up. And it's like, hold on a minute, why would I make that up? And B, are you so set in your ways that you can't see what is happening? And look, nobody is taking it away, that the rise in hate on both sides is horrific.
When I call out Islamophobia, I may be wrong about this, but when I call out Islamophobia, as I have done a lot, I did it repeatedly on my LBC radio show, I do it on social media. When I call it out, I don't tend to have people saying, well, what about anti-Semitism? Don't you care about anti-Semitism? I'm sure it's happened sometimes. But when I call out anti-Semitism, it's, well, what about other forms of racism? I'm equally committed to stamping out all forms of racism. It is just that we are seeing at the moment a very pronounced spike in anti-Semitism. And by the way, when the far right went marching to the cenotaph and abused the memory of our forefathers and foremothers, people who put their lives on the line and many of whom died for our freedoms and for this country. We saw those distasteful scenes at the cenotaph saying, we want our country back, England till I die. I call that out as well, and there's no doubt that that is directed at British Muslims, and it's very threatening.
But the people that did that, they were tackled straight away by the police, OK? And yet the other night we saw, again, a splinter group of Peace in Palestine protesters literally clambering all over the War Memorial, covered in poppy wreaths still at Hyde Park, and the police did nothing.
Climbing over the one war memorial in London that shows a dead soldier, one lying down.
Again, I'm not a spokesperson for the police, obviously, and clearly the police seem to have got some stuff wrong over recent weeks in a very difficult, febrile atmosphere. From my understanding from what they've said, it is not a specific criminal offence what went on there. If that is the case, then it should be made
but there are examples, and Don, I'm sure you've seen these examples as well online, where the police, sure, it's not a specific offence to climb on a statue or a monument, but there have been cases 2016 when Greenpeace clambered over lots of monuments.
8 arrests there.
The police arrested people on suspicion of criminal damage. Yes. Equally, when people have climbed on bridges, there have been arrests on suspicion of disturbing the peace. There have been ways that the police can arrest people for offences, even if what they're doing is not a specific offence in and of itself. I think we do need to move on to one more topic before we get to the end of this news review, but fascinating as though this is, because a huge story today. The former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has broken her silence on the Supreme Court's decision, and she has a 5-point plan in the Daily Telegraph.
So let's give the very brief context, and that is that Rishi Sunak said he was going to stop the boats this year. That hasn't happened. He said we're going to get flights up, didn't he, to go to Rwanda. Has that happened? The Rwanda Plan is an absolute shambles. It's a shambles partly because, as I understand it, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Rwanda, I think, have only agreed to accept 200 people. So the only possible way in which this plan could work, if it were to work, is as a deterrent. And I don't believe that sending 200 people to Rwanda will be a deterrent. On your question on the Suella Braverman 5-point plan in the Telegraph, I've got it here in the newspaper. One of the things that I find absolutely astonishing about this whole sorry saga is that Braverman is now saying, as I understand it, that the government or the Parliament should legislate against legal challenge to that legislation. Now, that seems to me both to be sinister but also legal fantasy. I don't think, and I think a government minister accepted as much, that we will see flights taking off to Rwanda next year. And as I say, even if we did, I don't think it would make significant difference.
And we have to take Rwandans in return as well. We've already paid them £120 million. Just sort this out. We've actually sent more Home Secretaries to Rwanda than we have migrants. It's a ridiculous situation. And you know, and when you say, Tom, that sort of like Suella has broken her silence, to be honest with you, she hasn't shut up, has she? I mean,
well, she's made 2 interventions since she resigned, or was fired, more accurately. She wrote her letter, and now she's written this article. I hate to spoil your morning as well, but we are expecting at some point next week a resignation statement in the benches of the House, on the green benches of the House of Commons as well. So a third intervention.
Except she hasn't resigned, of course. She's been sacked.
That's true. That's true. But I think she still does have the right to a statement. I might be wrong there, but I think she does have the right to.
Can I just say a quick thing? Another farcical element to Rwanda. And by the way, I'm someone who wants the boats to stop. I think you find the vast majority of people in this country want the boat to stop, at the very least, because it's very dangerous and imperils the lives of the people who are desperate enough to take that risk. But the Rwanda plan is not a solution, and the idea that Rishi Sunak can legislate, get Parliament to legislate, to pretend that Rwanda is a safe country when it is not, and I'll very briefly explain why it isn't, just because we can go on holiday to Rwanda. It's a beautiful country and no doubt has beautiful people in it, and you can go and see wildlife like the gorillas and so forth. The fact is it's an authoritarian regime with a very bad...
Didn't the UNHCR praise its refugee agency in recent years?
Yes, they did.
They may well have done. The fact is that Kagame, who is the president, he has been president since 2000. It is an authoritarian regime with an appalling human rights record. So if you're an asylum seeker, it ain't safe.
Well,
if we want to go on holiday there, we'll be just fine.
Just quickly, 2017, an international poll by Gallup showed that one of the most accepting and welcome countries for migrants, according to this poll, was Rwanda.
Well, we'll have to continue this in the next hour, but Dawn and Matthew, thank you so much for talking through those huge issues. After the break, we'll be live in Dover as more asylum seekers have been spotted crossing the channel. This is Britain's Newsroom.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. For most, a fine Friday, dry and bright with a bit of sunshine, but there is more rain to come tonight and tomorrow, and here's the reason why. An area of low pressure just gradually spreading in from the Atlantic. Ahead of it, a little bump in the isobars, a little ridge. We've seen some showers over northern England this morning. They'll tend to fade. There's some fog patches over northern Scotland, but most areas dry and bright. We are going to start to see the rain creeping into the Isles of Scilly and West Cornwall by the end of the afternoon, and steadily clouding over in South Wales and southwest England. Temperatures here getting up to 11-12 degrees, most places in single figures, but the winds are pretty light, so if you get in the sunshine, it feels pleasant enough. However, rain is coming into Northern Ireland, Wales and southwest England, where we have Met Office weather warnings in place. A lot of spray and surface water on the roads, but the rain will spread to most areas by the time we get to Saturday morning. Some quite heavy bursts in the southwest early on, but it should tend to clear through. It's a damp start for most areas, but by mid-morning, Wales and southwest England looking brighter. There will continue to be showers in Scotland, but for most, the afternoon will cheer up, brighten up with some sunny spells. A windier day, but a milder day tomorrow. Temperatures in the south getting into the teens for a time. Sunday looks also fairly blustery, gusty winds, particularly in the south. Some brightness, but plenty more showers to come as well. Bye for now.
Thanks, Alex. Now, still to come, our investigative reporter, Charlie Peters, will be with us to discuss his jaw-dropping GB News exclusive on what prisoners are getting up to in our communities. And we'll go live to Dover, where almost 1,000 people have crossed the channel in the last few days. You're with Britain's Newsroom here on GB News, the People's Channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning, it's 11 a.m. on Friday the 17th of November. This is Britain's Newsroom on GB News with me, Tom Harwood. Coming up this hour, the Rwanda Treaty will fail. The former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, declares no asylum seekers will be sent to Rwanda before the next election, in her view. Around 1,000 arrived via small boats over the last couple of days. Our Home and Security editor, Mark White, is live in Dover with the latest.
Well, it is the arrival of these small boats into Dover that really hammers home the need to try to find a solution to this crisis. In the last few days alone, 1,000 people have crossed in small boats.
Claimants crackdown. Free prescriptions and legal aid will be cut off for people who are deemed fit to work and refuse to seek employment as part of the Chancellor's new crackdown. Job centre disaster. GB News has discovered that dangerous criminals have been employed in schools, hospitals and communities, putting people at serious risk. It's a very busy morning of news, and through it all, we want to know your views and opinions. You know how to get in touch by now. gbviews@gbnews.com. We'll be getting to some of those thoughts after the morning headlines with Tatiana.
Tom, thank you very much and good morning. 1 minute past 11. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The former Home Secretary says the Prime Minister's plan to deport migrants to Rwanda will fail unless he opts out of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Will the Prime Minister rescue the Rwanda Plan, Mrs Braverman?
Suella Braverman, who was sacked this week, says the proposed new treaty and legislation are simply a tweaked version of the failed Plan A. Writing in The Telegraph, she set out what she's calling her 5 tests to ensure deportation flights can take off. Mrs Braverman says Rishi Sunak's proposal will get bogged down in the courts, but the Transport Secretary Mark Harper says the government won't be stopped.
When you set out very clearly in primary legislation the rules, and that Parliament sets out a very clear interpretation, as the Prime Minister says we're going to do when he made his announcement on Wednesday, then actually the courts do actually respect that. And as far as overseas courts are concerned, the Prime Minister has made it clear that we're not going to let overseas courts stand in our way. We're going to set out the rules very carefully. We're going to conclude that treaty with Rwanda, take that legislation through Parliament and continue with our plan.
2 12-year-old boys charged with the murder of a 19-year-old man are due to appear in court. Sean Sisahe was attacked in Wolverhampton on Monday night. He died at the scene. The children, who cannot be named because of their age, have also been charged with possession of a bladed article. Retail sales have unexpectedly fallen, dropping to their lowest level since the pandemic. The Office for National Statistics says retail sales volumes dipped 0.3% last month. Analysts had expected a rise. Retailers blame the cost of living, reduced footfall and wet weather. Sir Keir Starmer will pledge to make Britain a clean energy superpower. The Labour leader's in Aberdeen, where he'll tell industry bosses he'll support up to 50,000 jobs in Scotland if his party wins the next election. His visit comes at the end of a challenging week, suffering a major rebellion over his position on the war in Gaza. GB News understands there's concern within the party of a growing rift between Sir Keir and the Scottish Labour leader. And Asawa's MSP is looking likely to back an amendment in Holyrood next week calling for a ceasefire. Now, £8.3 billion has been promised to fix what the Prime Minister has described as the scourge of potholes. The funding for road maintenance in England will be available to local authorities over the next decade. The money was saved by scrapping the HS2 rail line north of Birmingham. Pothole campaigner Mark Morrell, also known as Mr Pothole, says the investment isn't enough.
Road users are being battered in terms of costs, with tens of billions of pounds in all sorts of taxation, very little being spent on our roads. I mean, with this extra funding, when it fully comes on stream, it will only bring it back up to what they were spending in 2019. And that's, 50% of what was being spent in 2006. So, if you're allowed for inflation, we should be putting in nearly £6 or £7 billion a year, not, £2 billion is going to be offered over the next 11 years.
British Gas is hiring hundreds of new staff. The energy giant says they'll work at contact centres across the UK to help customers who are struggling with their bills. Around 700 new jobs are being created by the end of the year. Rat-infested Bedford Prison has been issued with an urgent notice to improve. Inspectors found inmates are being held in mouldy cells with broken windows for up to 23 hours a day. Levels of violence against staff in the last month were also the highest of any adult male prison in the country and recorded self-harm the 3rd highest rate. It's the 5th jail to be given an urgent notice in the last 12 months. New draft guidance for the NHS says women should be offered talking therapy to combat the symptoms of menopause. That's alongside or instead of hormone replacement therapy. Better advice will also be offered about the risks and the benefits of HRT. Cognitive behavioural therapy is also being suggested to help with hot flushes, sleep and mood changes. The health watchdog says the move will give women more choice, but menopause specialist Dr Louise Newson has called the update disappointing. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now back to Tom.
Thanks, Tatiana. Now let's have a little look at what people have been saying at home. Throughout the course of the show, of course, we've been talking about the Rwanda article that the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has published this morning. Bob has written in to say Mrs Braverman has only just left government, so is presumably up to date with all Rwandan plans. It's therefore sensible to take her views seriously when she criticises the PM's new plan. Mary has written in about the drugs debate we had last hour, saying, I've never taken any drugs, but I've known friends who've smoked cannabis either for recreation or because it relieves their medical condition. It's time that cannabis was either decriminalised or legalised. Being able to buy from a specialist shop would stop purchasers being tempted by drug dealers. And Ken has written in to say, another issue with these ridiculous protests, he's referring, of course, to those pro-Palestinian protests, besides the fact that the conflict is nothing to do with this country, is the fact that the cost of police time has to fall on the taxpayer, and that is considerable. Some views from the viewing public. Of course, gbviews@gbnews.com if you want to get involved in the discussion. But the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has said that tinkering with a failed plan will not stop the boats. This comes as she lays down a devastating piece in The Telegraph this morning attacking the government's approach to the Rwanda scheme. She outlines her own 5-point plan. She says that the bill must address the Supreme Court's concerns and be treated as an emergency. She says flights must depart before the next general election, and in order to do so, must overrule the courts. She also says asylum seekers must be swiftly removed from the UK, and that those arriving illegally must be detained, and the whole bill should be treated as an emergency. Well, we broke earlier this morning the fact that around 1,000 migrants have arrived in small boats in the last few days, and more are expected with favourable weather conditions. Let's go to our man in Dover, GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White. Mark, tell us what you've seen this morning.
Well, the arrival of these boats, Tom, is the very visible manifestation of this crisis, of the failure of the UK government to do what it said it was going to do, which was to stop the boats. Now, it is true to say that the number of boats now this year compared to where we were at this point last year is about a third down, but it's still 27,500 who've crossed since the 1st of January this year. And just in the last few days and this week, where we had a spell of good weather for a day at the beginning of the week, yesterday was also good and today is good, around 1,000 people have crossed in about 20 small boats in that time. And it's an illustration, Tom, that whatever the government says, actually the weather plays a very significant part in the numbers who are crossing the English Channel. And every time we get a break in the weather and conditions improve, then these boats, sure as night follows day, these boats come across the English Channel in very significant numbers.
The government said that this would not be an easy task, stopping the boats, that there is not one magic silver bullet. The Prime Minister said that the Rwanda Plan is important, but also the cooperation with France and also going after the criminal gangs, not least with a lot of their storage facilities in Turkey that we've seen in recent months. Which do you think of these strands of the government's plan is the most important, and might they all be trumpeted by something as simple as the weather?
Well, whatever Rishi Sunak might be saying now, there is no doubt that the Rwanda plan was the key plank of the government's proposals to stop the small boats. Yes, of course, he said there is no silver bullet, and in the round you have to do more in the way of working better with France, giving them more money, as we've done, to help bolster their defences in northwestern France, also ensuring that the National Crime Agency works more closely with law enforcement partners around the world to go after the people smugglers, and also deal with those coming from the likes of Albania, so trying to have a deal which they now have secured with Albania to ensure the swift removal of anyone from Albania that comes over and tries to claim asylum. But key to that was absolutely the Rwanda plan. It was seen as a main issue that, as far as the government was concerned, would be the one that would help break the model of the criminal gangs, that would be a disincentive for those trying to cross the channel if they thought that there was a high chance that they wouldn't be staying in the UK, but they would be sent off to East Africa instead. So the fact that that is not happening or happening anytime soon is deeply embarrassing for the government, and is something that understandably infuriates many people in the UK who were told repeatedly that the boats would be stopped, that the Rwanda plan would go through. Well, here we are 19 months after it was first announced by Boris Johnson at Lyd Airport here in Kent, with Priti Patel across in Rwanda announcing that side of the deal as well, and nothing has happened. Only one day in June of last year did we get a flight that was close to taking off with a handful of people, but even that plane never took off. Not a single person has left for Rwanda, and if we listen to Suella Braverman, she is convinced that nothing is going to take off for Rwanda before the next election.
Just finally, Mark, how much of a deterrent would Rwanda actually be? Only a couple of hundred spaces there, when even today we've seen now, in the last few days, 1,000 new migrants arrive by small boat. That's more than the capacity of Rwanda, isn't it?
Yeah, I think this is one of the untruths, though, that has been put about by Labour and opposition, chiefly among them, in terms of the numbers going to Rwanda. When I was across there with Suella Braverman earlier this year, we specifically asked on that point, because Labour kept hammering home their assertion that only a couple of hundred people were going to Rwanda. And both the UK and the Rwandan government were quite explicit that there is no cap on the numbers. However, in a briefing, it was suggested to me that the hope is that a relatively small number of people would need to be sent there, and that would, in short order, they hope, break the business model. So we put it to them, what, 1,000, 2,000? So perhaps that kind of number, and then they would see the business model disintegrating. I'm not so sure. You know, with 50-odd thousand coming across the channel in 1 year, okay, maybe not this year, but certainly last year, if you are unfortunate enough to be the 1,000 or 2,000 that might be sent, I think those are pretty good odds for those that have come all the way, many thousands of miles and across 2 seas to get to the UK. They would probably still be undeterred.
Well, Mark White, this is why we appreciate you so much as our Home and Security Editor. Clear answer there, no cap on the number that could be sent to Rwanda were this scheme to actually get off the ground. Live in Dover, thank you very much for all that you've brought to us this morning. Let's dissect this a little bit further now with the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. And Henry, this is a problem for the government. They have bigged up this issue of small boat arrivals. We know that there are fewer asylum seekers in the United Kingdom than there are in France, in Germany, in Italy, in many other comparable European countries. And yet the government has made this issue one that is much bigger. Is that hurting them?
It is hurting them because they keep raising the salience of this issue and then failing to do anything about it. The reason they're doing that is because the small boat crossings are kind of a really visible symbol of a failure to control the borders in a way that a much higher amount of legal immigration, which polling suggests the public don't like, but that doesn't have the same kind of visual impact as people washing up on boats. It's a basic state failure. So yeah, absolutely. The more they put this front and centre without making progress, they'd be better off just not talking about it.
And yet, when we heard James Cleverly speak in the Commons earlier this week, he was saying that crossings are down by a third. The French, cooperating with the British, have stopped 22,000 people crossing on the beaches. In the UK, we've seen illegal migration fall, whereas in France, Germany, Italy, many other European countries, we've seen it rise by a considerable degree this year. Is there not a positive story to tell there?
There is. James Cleverly made a pretty good job of making it. That's one of the things he's very good at as a politician. But the problem is this isn't going to go away, right? The migration crises that are pushing people into Europe and towards the United Kingdom are not slowing down. They're only going to get worse. And that pressure just builds up on the French coast. And eventually, more people start coming across. You need a systemic solution because otherwise you'll have good years and bad years, but it all adds up, right? Because it's all an inflow.
And the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has written quite a detailed piece in The Telegraph this morning. Is her view, is her five-point plan, in your view, something that can be that systemic change?
I mean, Suella's plan, if she implemented it, would make the Rwanda Plan work better. I don't think it will happen. There is simply not time before the election for such a bill to get passed if the Lords refuse to pass it. And her proposal is extraordinary. Basically, there's a balance or a trade-off. The more effective any bill is at restricting the ability to challenge it legally, the smaller the coalition that will be for it in the House of Commons, and the more opposed the Lords will be. So Suella's plan is just not going to happen.
Right.
So what's actually happening here is we're going to have a year of a showdown between the government and the House of Lords, where the government can blame the House of Lords for blocking whatever this legislation is, and then they'll fight the election on it.
That is a really interesting strategy because it's very similar to what Boris Johnson did in 2019. Say, look, we've got this Brexit deal here, we want to pass this, the Parliament is rotten, it's stopping us from doing what we want, we're going to go to the people, get that mandate, and of course he was very successful, almost fighting against the establishment in that election. Do you think that could work a second time, or will people say, hang on, guys, it's not like last time where you didn't have a majority, you've got a majority. Yes, you don't have a majority in the House of Lords, but you've got a majority in the Commons. Why can't you do your job?
I think it might work with some anti-immigration voters because it will at least look like the government is doing something. And the big problem, of course, is Labour doesn't have an answer, right? Safe and legal routes is not an alternative because if you want any kind of controls, the battle over Rwanda is a battle between people with a bad answer and people with no answer. But it's not going to split the electorate in the same way that Brexit did. And secondly, Brexit was a new problem, right? And Boris Johnson was a new Prime Minister. So it was like, OK, fine, you know, Boris is new, Brexit only happened in 2016. The Conservatives have been in power for 14 years by the next election, and immigration has been a problem or an issue for the entire time. So I think that even if you're a voter who's minded to like the legislation, there'll be a sense of like, guys, why are you trying to pass this legislation now? What were you doing from like 2015 when you first got ruled on your own without Liberal Democrats to now? Why is this only happening now? So I think it'll be very difficult to win an election on that basis.
And we're also seeing some consternation within the Parliamentary Conservative Party. There's a tweet that I believe we can look at now from Damian Green, the former immigration minister, criticising the former Home Secretary, saying that her idea to get rid of oversight from courts, both domestic and international, is the most unconservative statement that he has ever heard from a Conservative politician. He compares this idea of giving the state power to override legal constraints as something that Putin would do or President Xi would do. Do you think that's a widely held view amongst Conservatives?
It will cause deep disquiet. What we've got, and I think we're only in the foothills of this, I think this is going to be a really big issue over the next decade, 2 decades, is that the UK is committed to so many legal obligations, both international and domestic, and a lot of those are like vaguely worded, nice-sounding statements, which then the judges... that it's very hard for government to act. Very hard for government to act because there are so many grounds for legal challenge now. Judicial review has always been part of our constitution, but there's far more of it than there was before. And so what you get instead is you get the backlash, which is politicians like Suella Braverman trying to find these really simple, like, cut through the Gordian knot.
Just ignore all of the courts and go and do your own thing.
Which is also bad, right? Like, having judicial oversight of the executive is important. And but because currently judicial oversight just leads to getting nothing done, so I think we are going to need to look at a balance. I think Suella was answering...
In your view, the government needs to do this middle path of perhaps reform the way or unpick certain bits of constraint but leave other bits?
You need to do it properly, right? Which is you need to look at all of the obligations that we've got which make this policy impossible. You need to have an honest debate about
Which I don't think I've seen a single individual name all of them. The ECHR is obviously one, but the Supreme Court referenced a number of others.
And then you need to reform or repeal that legislation, because otherwise you end up with this crazy position where you've got this mass of unwieldy law and then you've just got individual policy initiatives which ignore it completely. And that's a recipe for bad policy in both directions. The politicians need to do the hard work of looking at everything they've passed or signed on the last 20 years and deciding whether or not it actually works.
Wow. That is a job of work to do. Perhaps that's why politicians don't want to do it.
Precisely.
Henry Hill, thank you so much for making a very complicated issue sound a lot more digestible. Well, up next, a GB News exclusive. Dozens of dangerous ex-prisoners have been mismanaged and are putting the public at risk. Find out how next. You're with Britain's Newsroom on GB News.
Who is it? We're here for the show. Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour with me, John Cleese. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back, it's 11:25 and you're with Britain's Newsroom here on GB News with me, Tom Harwood. Well, dozens of dangerous ex-prisoners with severe court order restrictions have been mismanaged by an Oxford job centre, putting the public at risk, a whistleblower has told GB News. High-risk ex-convicts, including violent sexual offenders, murderers and rapists, were managed at the job centre in central Oxford without their restrictions being recorded or observed, leading to several violations of public protection arrangements. In one shocking example, a child sex offender who groomed his victims online was given a smartphone by the job centre without any restrictions placed upon it. Our reporter Charlie Peters has this exclusive report.
Could we be working with convicted murderers, rapists and sex groomers? Is it possible that paedophiles released from prison can be given internet-enabled devices? GB News has heard allegations from a former civil servant at the Department for Work and Pensions that a system in job centres designed to help former prisoners get back into work is not only flawed, but putting the public and even victims of their crimes at risk. I met with Mark, not his real name, who joined the Oxford Job Centre in April 2021 and took on responsibilities for handling ex-prisoners.
There was absolutely no support, no handover, no specialist training. I would be supporting sexual offenders, violent offenders, stranger rapists.
When working with ex-prisoners, DWP civil servants should process intelligence called Multi-Agency Public Protection Arrangements, or MAPA, that detail their restrictions in work and training. Mark alleged that this information was often missing.
I later learned of a universal credit claimant I was interviewing. He had MAPA conditions due to the fact he was a sexual offender, but there was no MAPA intelligence or safeguarding measures pinned to his digital account. I contacted the MAPA lead for the office, and the response that I got back was, if we don't have the MAPA intelligence from the National Probation Service, we do not chase it. That is not our job. And at that point, I realised we have a huge problem.
Mark also claimed that there were problems in storing and reviewing information about ex-prisoners.
All the physical MAPA-J documentation is stored under lock and key in a cabinet. When I first accessed that folder, I was absolutely appalled. Clearly hadn't been reviewed for over 10 years. There was over 20 MAPA-J documents in that folder where court order restrictions had expired years prior to me accessing that folder.
After an incident where a convicted paedophile was allegedly given a smartphone against his restrictions, Mark notified the office that they had a big problem.
Did we have sexual offenders, stranger rapists applying for work, applying for training opportunities that still had MAPA-J restrictions in place, court order restrictions? We just didn't know. It was impossible to ascertain.
A senior manager wrote back to say, "You have identified a massive risk for both this case and wider." But Mark alleged that nothing was done. No safeguarding measures were put in place, and more incidents occurred. GB News has heard compelling testimony about other incidents where the DWP allegedly failed to observe restrictions applied to ex-prisoners. In one case, the Oxford Job Centre offered work to a notorious paedophile. He had already been given a laptop with internet access. This man, who we cannot name for legal reasons, preyed on vulnerable young girls in one of Britain's worst grooming gang scandals. Mark said that he kept reporting these alleged failures, but was not listened to.
My caseload was a minefield, an absolute minefield. I had no support in this matter. No one was taking it seriously.
With the strain of working with ex-prisoners and what he said was a failure to react to his concerns, Mark had a total breakdown and has been hospitalised regularly since.
You lose composure and rationality. My role was my tool to keep people safe. You take the role away, you still have the concerns, and the public are still at risk, but you can't do anything about it. You've been silenced by the very people that are supposed to be supporting you.
Well, we invited the Department of Work and Pensions to come on the programme, but they declined. But in a statement, they insist former convicts are monitored in the workplace and they promised to investigate. The statement says, "We take all staff concerns very seriously and are committed to investigating any issues that are raised. Documents held by Oxford Job Centre on customers with restrictions are up to date and regularly reviewed. Training is provided for Job Centre staff nationwide, and we continue to work closely with Thames Valley Probation Service and others, so we have the necessary detail on applicants' personal circumstances." Well, I'm joined in the studio by our investigative reporter, Charlie Peters. And Charlie, just how shocking is this? Do we know that this is an isolated incident in Oxford, or could this be around the country?
Well, this is the big question now. How widespread is this problem? We do know from these claims by our whistleblower that this has been an extensive problem, according to them, in the Oxford Job Centre, for some time. I mean, we first heard about these allegations earlier this year, and we looked through very compelling testimony and allegations going back for several months before the start of this year. But GB News has also heard from whistleblowers at other job centres, both in the region surrounding Oxfordshire, but also others further away, raising similar concerns about the processing of dangerous ex-prisoners without these MAPA conditions, these court order restrictions that detail what you can and cannot do, being properly recorded or processed. In some cases, they're not there at all. And going through all this evidence, and of course there's so much we can't even include in that package just due to the length of the reporting, many of the ex-offenders who are looking for work actually informed their work coaches that they had restrictions during the course of being interviewed. So nothing was on their accounts, and whistleblowers and work coaches in these job centres have said to us, you know, I've offered someone work as a cleaner at a school, and they've said, no, I can't do that, I'm a paedophile. That kind of conversation happening in a job centre. So at the moment, we don't know just how widespread this problem is.
Shocking.
But it clearly is a significant issue, in particular in Oxford.
Relying on criminals themselves to explain their own restrictions. Just in our last final few seconds, is this a problem of frankly, laziness in the civil service or a problem of digitalisation? Where does the fault lie?
There are many factors at play here, according to the whistleblowers, but the main allegation that they are making, and in particular Mark, who we heard from in that report, is that it's a systematic failure to properly process the information. There are so many moving parts, so many different agencies involved in these public protection arrangements, and it just seems, according to them, that they're not doing their duties.
Well, Charlie Peters, thank you so much for bringing us that shocking and at times harrowing report. Really, really profound stuff there. But it's time for your news headlines now with Tatiana Sanchez.
Tom, thank you. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The former Home Secretary says the Prime Minister's plan to deport migrants to Rwanda will fail unless he opts out of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Will the Prime Minister rescue the Rwanda Plan, Mrs Braverman?
Suella Braverman, who was sacked this week, says the proposed new treaty and legislation is simply a tweaked version of the failed Plan A. Writing in The Telegraph, she set out what she's calling her 5 tests to ensure deportation flights can take off. Mrs Braverman says Rishi Sunak's proposal will get bogged down in the courts. 2 12-year-old boys charged with murder of a 19-year-old man are due to appear in court. Sean Sihahai was attacked in Wolverhampton on Monday night and died at the scene. The children, who cannot be named because of their age, have also been charged with possession of a bladed article. Retail sales have unexpectedly fallen, dropping to their lowest level since the pandemic. The Office for National Statistics says retail sales volumes dipped 0.3% last month. Analysts had expected a rise. Retailers blame the cost of living, reduced footfall and wet weather. £8.3 billion has been promised to fix what the Prime Minister has described as the scourge of potholes. The funding for road maintenance in England will be available to local authorities over the next decade. The money was saved by scrapping the HS2 rail line north of Birmingham. For more on all of those stories, you can visit our website, gbnews.com.
for exclusive, limited edition and rare gold coins that are always newsworthy. Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2432 and €1.1433 euros. The price of gold, £1,601 and 91 pence per ounce. And the FTSE 100 at 7,477 points.
Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Thanks, Tatiana. Now, up next, we'll find out why rodent infestations in England have increased by 12% this year. This is Britain's Newsroom on GB News.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back, it's 11:39 and you're with Britain's Newsroom here on GB News with me, Tom Harwood. Now, cheese. It's yummy, mouldy, yellow and sometimes squishy. But camembert makers are up in arms. My panel guests from the previous hour return, Dawn Neeson and Matthew Stadlen. And Dawn, what is up with our dairy goodness this time?
Who
Did you write that?
I didn't write.
Did you actually write that?
I
Did you
didn't
use
write
the word
that. I have to say.
Squishy.
I didn't write the word squishy. My wonderful production team have put these words into my mouth.
This is you don't have to say them. This is a very serious story. How dare you use the word squishy? Yeah, this is in the Daily Mail. It's cheesemakers in France have hit out at an EU move, them again, to outlaw the wooden boxes that contain camembert. You know when you go and get the round, sort of like a cardboardy type thing. Well, how would you describe it?
It's a sort of halfway between wood and cardboard, isn't it? I know exactly what you mean. Balsa wood, perhaps.
Very probably.
Yeah.
It's not squishy in any case. But the proposal is to coordinate packaging across the EU bloc. We've been
it's all got to be the same.
Bananas, etc. It all has to be the same by 2030, which means that the camembert boxes are literally toast, like cheese on toast. See?
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
I would have thought that wooden boxes are more economic or more environmentally friendly than plastic.
It all has to be the same. That's the thing, and that's what the French are saying. They're saying, well, they are very environmentally friendly. If you want to put it all in plastic, so the same across the EU bloc, it's not very environmentally friendly. So they are up in arms.
And this affects us not obviously because we are part of the EU anymore, which we are not, but because we don't make our own camembert because camembert is French. So
right, and it's got geographical protections on it, I imagine.
I would have thought so.
Yeah.
So we import our camembert, and now we are not going to be able to have camembert in wooden boxes. Is this right?
Yes, that's right. It's going to be in plastic, which is not very good.
That sounds like it's completely opposite direction of just about anything else we're buying.
Exactly.
Do you know what? The House of Commons recently has changed its cutlery. You used to have disposable plastic cutlery, and as of very recently, the last couple of weeks, it's turned into this horrible disposable stuff that just doesn't work.
Like wooden stuff.
Like wooden and slightly papery
I don't
and
like that.
yeah.
I have a thing about wood and ice lolly sticks, and I just don't like the feel of it.
A very long time ago, when I was growing up, we were told not to waste paper. That was a big thing.
Right.
Now we seem to be using quite a lot of wood or paper, do we?
Yeah.
And that's not a good thing if we're thinking about protecting our forests, which are, by the way, still a very important component in the battle against climate change.
God, it's all very complicated, isn't it?
And it's just all about squishy cheese.
No, and a very, very important story, Dawn. Thank you so much for bringing it to our attention.
Welcome.
I think it is the most profound challenge we currently face, not just as a country, but as a continent.
Yeah, exactly.
Matthew, perhaps turning to something slightly more serious, the front page of The Guardian today is talking about sexual assault and harassment in the Ministry of Defence.
Yeah, this is a much more serious story, and it's a bombshell. It is. I found it really surprising, actually, and shocking that, what are we now, 6 years after the Me Too movement began, that one of the great offices of state, and I don't mean, of course, the Secretary of State for Defence himself, but the Ministry of Defence seems to be riddled with sexism and misogyny. So 60 senior women, and 60 of them, that's a lot, at the Ministry of Defence have described a hostile and toxic culture in a letter that alleges sexual assault, harassment and abuse by male colleagues. And some examples are given, and they're all very, very reprehensible. The MOD has said for its part that it's very concerned about this, and I hope very much that they will get on top of it. But why are we still seeing these sorts of stories?
That is the point, Matthew. I'm shocked that you're shocked. Every woman listening and watching this will tell you now that they are not shocked. This goes on in every single industry. And since the hashtag #MeToo movement, actually nothing's changed. Nothing's changing fast
that's one of the
whatsoever.
really interesting, important points, I think, that you make, because I remember discussing this endlessly.
Just one this morning. I think I made at least two. Come on.
But I remember on national radio discussing and debating the Me Too movement extensively and almost exhaustively. And one of the things that was brought up at the time was when one hoped that this would finally change things, a few voices piped up and said, but will it really? Or will we just return? And it seems from this sort of article that it hasn't changed things, or at least not remotely sufficiently.
Well, we're going to have to pause now because we've just heard in from the Prime Minister, a very latest interview with the Prime Minister, minutes ago speaking. Let's hear what he had to say.
Progress. People may not know this, that this year, because of all the things that we've done, the number of illegal migrants crossing to the UK is down by a third. Everyone told me that wasn't possible, but because we worked really hard, we're returning thousands of people to places like Albania. We've got the numbers down by a third already, but we're not going to stop there. That's progress, but I want to finish the job, and that means getting Rwanda up and running. I'm determined to do everything it takes to make that happen, and that means bringing forward emergency legislation that will declare that Rwanda is safe for these purposes. We've negotiated a new treaty with them, and we will make sure that domestic courts cannot block systemically our flights to Rwanda. And I've been also very clear that I won't let a foreign court stop us getting a flight off. That's my plan, and I'm going to work night and day to make it happen.
Aren't you just tinkering, though, with Plan A, and you don't really have a serious alternative?
No, as I said, the progress we've made this year on tackling this issue is meaningful. The number of crossings are down by a third this year because we're working with other countries to crack down on the criminal gangs. We've returned 20,000 people to places like Albania, and that's why the numbers are down by a third. But I don't want to stop there. In order to finish the job, we've got to get the Rwanda Plan up and running. I will do whatever it takes to make that happen. People are sick of this merry-go-round. I want to end it. My patience is wearing thin like everyone else's. That's why our emergency legislation will make it crystal clear that Rwanda is safe for these purposes. It meets all the concerns that people have raised because of our new arrangement with them, and we want to stop any more domestic challenges to this programme. And I've also been clear that we won't let a foreign court stand in the way of us getting a flight off to Rwanda.
It takes a long time, though, as you know, for legislation to get through Parliament. Would you call an election if the Lords block your plan?
Well, it doesn't have to take a long time to get legislation through, and that's a question for the Labour Party. We're determined to get this through as quickly as possible. So the real question is, are the Labour Party going to stand in the way and stop this from happening, or are they going to work with us and support this bill so we can get it through as quickly as possible? I know that the British people want this problem gripped. I know the British people will want this new law to pass so we can get flights off to Rwanda. So really the question is for Keir Starmer and Labour Party, why don't they?
Damian Green has said overruling laws is akin to Putin in Russia.
This is not about overruling laws. This is about us meeting the concerns of the Supreme Court with our new treaty that we have been working on for a while in anticipation that this might happen. But our new laws will make it crystal clear that Parliament's view is that because of those arrangements, Rwanda is a safe country for us to be able to run this programme, and that there should be no more challenges domestically to that. I think that's what the British people want. Their patience has worn thin, as has mine. Everyone's frustrated with this problem. We've just got to now get past this gridlock. We've got to pass this new law, get flights off to Rwanda. That's what I'm going to do. When I said I was going to stop the boats, I meant it.
You say everyone supports that. Why not take it to the country and ask them if they do?
Well, I think people just want the problem fixed. That's what I'm here to do. And this year we've already got the numbers down by a third. That's because I've got new deals with the French, a new deal with Albania. We're working with Turkey and Bulgaria, multiple other countries. We're tackling the criminal gangs. We're cutting through the backlog. We're getting people out of hotels, saving taxpayers money. And as I said, numbers down by a third shows real progress. People can see that I want to get this thing done. But in order to finish the job, we need to get Rwanda up and running. We can pass these laws in Parliament. That will give us the powers and the tools we need. Then we can get the flights off. And look, whether it's the House of Lords or the Labour Party standing in our way, I will take them on because I want to get this thing done and I want to stop the boats.
One final poll question on the autumn statement. Here we are in a classroom. Expectations in maths. It says on the wall behind you. What expectations can people have of tax cuts? Now it seems the Chancellor has a little more room.
Well, the most important thing economically that's happened this week is that we met the pledge that I made to halve inflation. Now, of course, I know people are still suffering. They have been, so there's work to do. But that's an important milestone because inflation is like a tax. It makes everyone feel poorer. It puts the prices of things up, eats into your savings, your pensions, and that's why it was so important to halve inflation. I've delivered on that because I want to ease the burden on the cost of living for families. But that allows us now to see what other support we can provide. For example, this winter, pensioners will receive hundreds of pounds in extra support alongside their winter fuel payment to help them with energy bills because we know they're high. But look, this Conservative government has delivered. We are starting to ease the burden on the cost of living. There's work to do, and you'll hear more about that next week in the autumn statement.
Minister speaking in the last few minutes in Bolsover in a primary school, talking about the autumn statement there at the end there, but also crucially about his plans for Rwanda. Your reaction, Matthew?
Just astonished. Is there a single viewer of GB News this morning who buys into any of this stuff? Not only, as we've discussed, is the plan a really poor plan because we're not going to be able to send enough people to Rwanda, even if we are allowed to send people to Rwanda. But he's saying that the British public are sick and tired of this, as is he, that they're sick and tired of this merry-go-round. He's the Prime Minister. He's suggesting that he's up against these sort of hostile forces. He's the Prime Minister. This is his plan. He should own it. It's failed. Get on and secure our borders, and you're not going to do that by flushing more and more taxpayers' money down the loo in a policy that won't work.
He's the Prime Minister, but it has been the courts that have stopped him, not the House of Commons.
He's been warned about that,
and
though, Tom.
The big criticism here is it could be the House of Lords that stops his new legislation.
He knew all this and would have been advised of all this when he came up with this flagship policy. This is a government that has been in power for 13 years. This is their main policy. He told us he would stop the boats. He keeps on saying now that he's stopped 1/3 of the votes. That means he hasn't stopped 2/3 of the votes. No one is buying it.
Dawn, do you think that sounded a bit like what we might hear from the general election campaign, saying, look, I tried to stop the votes, but the House of Lords stopped me. Elect me so I can deal with this once and for all?
I might be wrong here. You're the political journalist more than me, but if the House of Lords, if it does overrule it, there is a mechanism in place where the House of Commons, the elected, can overrule
but the Parliament Act means that the House of Lords can delay for a year.
Right.
Now, that takes us to the next election. That's fine if it's at the start of a Parliament, but we're at the end of a Parliament now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, I mean, a couple of things there. I thought he looked actually quite ill. I think he looks exhausted. I think he looks like he's not sleeping at the moment, and understandably, the stress that he's under this week is beginning to tell, I think. I mean, this legislation that he keeps talking about, and sort of like, you know, the European Court of Human Rights, and we are, you know, not going to listen to the European courts anymore. It was a British court. There were British judges using British legislation that stopped the Rwanda Plan. So we are now going to legislate saying Rwanda is a safe country. How can the UK legislate that a foreign country is safe? Because we could do that for Gaza then, couldn't we? I mean, it's fine. Absolutely no problem with that. Gaza, we've legislated, it's fine. So I don't understand what legislation he's talking about. The devil is in the detail. And we're not being given any detail.
I think one of the points is this new treaty that is going to be signed is going to forbid refoulement, or however we want to pronounce that word.
Yes, I know.
It's going to forbid Rwanda sending people on to other countries that are unsafe in treaty-level legislation.
Do we seriously think, though, look, that absolutely is part of what he's saying. Do we seriously think, though, if you accept my premise, which is that Rwanda is an authoritarian state, with the president I said earlier, who's been in power since 2000, that they would, if it didn't suit them, obey a treaty with Britain? Come on, if we are prepared to break our international obligations, as we've hinted that we might in recent years of Tory government, do we seriously expect that Rwanda are going to uphold them?
And the agreement was already there. It wasn't legislation, but the agreement was there.
There was a memorandum of understanding.
We will treat the people that you send to us, and remember, it's only a small number of people, and we accept Rwandans in return.
What's happened? This is a law of diminishing returns. This is a policy that continues to fail. So why not junk the policy and get serious about shoring up our borders, work with the French, get more patrol boats out, be
The Prime Minister might say he is doing that, and we have seen 22,000 people stopped by the French and British cooperation, but we're running to the end of the programme. Up next, it's GB News Live with Emily Carver. What's coming up, Emily?
It is indeed. Thank you very much, Tom. So we're going to be looking at, in a little bit more detail, what Rishi Sunak actually has planned when it comes to the Rwanda scheme. Will it go ahead? Will he be able to get flights off to Rwanda before the next election? It's looking unlikely. Suella Braverman certainly does not think so. We're also going to be heading to Israel to speak to Elon Levi, the Israeli government spokesperson there. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, has had a few controversial remarks, particularly over civilian casualties in the last day, so we'll be getting to grips with that.
Well, Emily, look forward to seeing it. And indeed, we've come to the end of Britain's Newsroom today. You're with GB News, and thank you so much for your company over the last 2.5 hours. I'll be back with you with a brand new show on Monday from midday. But before all of that, be sure to stick around for GB News Live coming up next. You're with GB News, the People's Channel.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin. This is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. For most, a fine Friday. Dry and bright with a bit of sunshine, but there is more rain to come tonight and tomorrow. And here's the reason why. An area of low pressure just
gradually spreading in from the Atlantic. Ahead of it, a little bump in the isobars, a little ridge. We've seen some showers over northern England this morning. They'll tend to fade. There's some fog patches over northern Scotland, but most areas dry and bright. We are going to start to see the rain creeping into the Isles of Scilly and West Cornwall by the end of the afternoon, and steadily clouding over in South Wales and southwest England. Temperatures here getting up to 11, 12 degrees, most places in single figures, but the winds are pretty light, so if you get in the sunshine, it feels pleasant enough. However, rain is coming into Northern Ireland, Wales and southwest England, where we have Met Office weather warnings in place. A lot of spray and surface water on the roads, but the rain will spread to most areas by the time we get to Saturday morning. Some quite heavy bursts in the southwest early on.